Welcome to Just Champions, a podcast by Equitas, which focuses on the prosecution of sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, and trafficking from the perspective of the prosecutors who handle these cases, the allied professionals with whom they collaborate, and the victims and communities that they serve. I'm Jennifer Long, the CEO and co-founder of Equitas, and a former prosecutor specializing in adult and child sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, stalking, and sexual exploitation. And this is the inaugural season of Just Champions, where we will explore the ways prosecutors can influence justice and safety through the lens of our guests who impacted safety and justice for victims in ways you may not expect. In this episode, I'm joined by Jennifer Sommers, who is currently the Deputy Director of the Center for Management and Technical Assistance at the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF. Previously, Jennifer served as an Assistant District Attorney in a rural county in upstate New York, as well as in the Monroe County District Attorney's Office. She also served in the Monroe County Sheriff's Office and the New York State Office of the Attorney General.
Hi, Jen.
Hi, Jen.
Hi, I'm so glad that you are willing and able to spend some time with me today to talk about your experiences as a prosecutor and all the places it's led you throughout your career.
Oh, great. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yes. And so I figured out in doing a few of these now that as well as I think I know people, I don't know all the parts of their career as well as I think I did. So I thought you could tell me a little bit about your career and about your decision to become a prosecutor.
Sure. Well, I originally, I thought I wanted to be a scientist. After college, I was in a PhD program in toxicology at the University of Rochester. And I liked the program. I really enjoyed learning about science, but I kind of realized that I didn't love the lab work enough to spend the rest of my life in a lab. But I still really had an affinity for science. So I left with my master's degree and went to law school thinking that I'd kind of make use of my science degrees in a different way. And we can kind of get into that, but I started at a small upstate New York district attorney's office the day after I took the bar exam.
Wow.
And then after a few years, I went to the Monroe County District Attorney's Office, which is Rochester, New York. So it was much bigger. All told, I was a county prosecutor for about 11 years. And then I spent 7 years as counsel to the largest full service or multi-bureau sheriff's office in New York, which was a really incredible experience. And then I spent 9 years at the New York State Attorney General's office. For nearly all that time, I was the deputy chief and then the upstate supervising chief of the unit that reviewed civilian deaths caused by police, whether justified or not, to determine whether or not an officer should be prosecuted and to see whether recommendations could be made that would avoid similar deaths in the future. So that was about 26 years of my life altogether. And now I am a deputy director with the Police Executive Research Forum, which is a DC-based think tank whose mission is to really push out into the field best policing practices and information. So that's like a complete overview of my career.
And it's so interesting because I'm realizing when you're talking, I have known you for a large part of that career. And as we'll talk about, I met you around your work around domestic and sexual violence. And regardless of where your specific positions took you, I stayed in touch with you and we worked together on those issues. So, it's interesting to me how and this is maybe part of why you chose prosecution, but how you chose prosecution and to specialize in domestic violence, sexual violence, and the related crimes, perhaps of child abuse, stalking, exploitation. As we know, it's hard to touch any one of these crimes without seeing indicia of the other crimes and having to work on them as well.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So I can't say that when I went to law school, my intention was to become a prosecutor, period. But I did do an internship my third year. I, not that, not to get too personal. I was married and I commuted and I had a baby in the middle of law school. So I sort of didn't do some of the things that you're supposed to do,
Yeah, you're like an overachiever, though. And I
no,
think
no, to kind of seal your future, and you're supposed to do this in your second year and everything. But my last year of law school, I did an internship at a small district attorney's office, and because I had originally thought I would maybe do something with like environmental law or toxic torts, I just wasn't sure. But I did that internship, and it was absolutely transformative. I loved it. This was back in 1996, when DNA and forensics. I know it's difficult for people to understand this as we sit in 2024, but back then, those things were just starting to make their way into the world of criminal justice, whereas now it's sort of taken for granted that, of course, there's going to be forensic aspects. But I being able to speak the language of science generally and toxicology in particular was incredibly helpful. So I just had this great experience interning at that DA's office, and that DA, literally found me my first job in a DA's office, and I truly fell in love with that work. When you say what led you to sort of crimes of sexual violence, domestic violence, it's interesting. Starting in a smaller DA's office, you don't see the same types of crime in the same number as you would see when you're in a city. So during the entire time that I was in the smaller county, we didn't have, other than motor vehicle DWI related homicides, we didn't have a single murder. We didn't have a single homicide. You don't see like the gang violence that you would see in a city, but universally, wherever you prosecute, be it a small county or a big city, whatever, you are sadly going to see domestic violence. You're going to see child abuse. You're going to see sexual assault. So those almost from the get-go were just ever present. They are, I mean, I hate to say this, but that is the universality of these types of crimes. So one thing I'll say, to people who work in smaller counties, it is far easier to kind of affect changes in the way that those incidents are investigated and prosecuted in a smaller county. Because there's less bureaucracy, right? If you're motivated, and the people that you need to get involved are also motivated, you can collaborate with them often by just picking up a phone, and you can schedule meetings, things that are just much more difficult when you go to a bigger office. So during that time when I was in the smaller community, really thanks to people far outside of myself, CPS, investigators, we really, to the credit of a lot of people, went from a siloed way of working these cases that would often re-traumatize victims to one where I think the collaboration was just outstanding. So I kind of got into those crimes because of their ever-present nature. Also, the Violence Against Women Act kind of was enacted in and around that time. And I wrote a grant for the county. So we were able to essentially make my position simply the special victims prosecutor. So it was a time when a lot was changing and a lot more was becoming available and known about how best to serve victims. So when I got to a larger county, again, there's so many positives and negatives about both, right? Like I told you, the positive of the smaller counties, you can affect change quicker. The positive of the bigger county is that you have investigators, for instance, who are doing this over and over again, who become very good at it. So that was great. Although there were great investigators in both places, but when I first got to the larger county, and again, I got to the larger county in 2003, so over 20 years ago. The DA's office at that time had a DV child abuse unit, but sexual assaults, including rapes, were handled in the Violent Felony Bureau. So they were handled not by the prosecutors who were doing DV cases and child abuse cases. They were handled by the same prosecutors, including myself, who were doing murders and robberies and attempted murders. And frankly, and there's no shame in this, a lot of prosecutors would rather do those cases, right? Like, so that's kind of that's a fact of the way it is. But I, because of my toxicology background in particular, started to be assigned a great disproportionate number of the alcohol facilitated sex assaults, because I was one of the only prosecutors who was willing to actually take them on and try them. And Jen, I'm sure you see this and have seen it and continue to see it. I mean, if you are ruled by statistics and numbers, the alcohol facilitated sex assaults are the hardest cases on which to obtain convictions. So lots of people wish to stay away from those cases.
Very complex. That is for
Yes.
sure, right?
Yeah.
Because
Oh,
all of that victim blaming and all of that quote unquote, I know people can't see me, I'm doing the fake air quotes,
yeah. Mhm.
common sense, right? It's
Oh, yeah.
all just laden with bias, and you mix that up with the rape myths and
Yeah.
the lack of understanding of the toxicology,
Oh,
and you
yes.
really have an uphill battle. But it's an uphill battle that, as I was lucky enough to teach with you and just work with you side by side on TAs, I'm not to minimize it, but can
Mhm.
be won, or if it's lost in spite of having a prosecutor who knows how to explain these issues,
Yeah.
and a jury has basically decided to ignore that evidence, to
Yeah.
the peril of all of us, I think.
And it's also, I mean, it always is worth, right? It's so common sense and self-evident that it's almost like awful to say it out loud, but to just ignore an entire type of crime is unconscionable. It leaves an entire group of perpetrators with a complete lack of, I don't even have to worry about these things, because who's gonna, you can commit crime with impunity. It also leaves an entire group of victims and survivors with nobody willing to take their case seriously. So,
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think about our great friend, Teresa.
oh,
Yes, who at least introduced me. Maybe you had known this before because you were toxicology, but that great phrase, I think it was from Antonia Abbey, but it might have been from a different researcher around alcohol facilitated sexual assault. Who needs
oh,
force when
yep.
you have alcohol,
You
right?
need force when you need alcohol. Yes,
Yep. If
exactly.
alcohol was a weapon, it would be a sledgehammer.
It's
And
so true. It is so true. It's just, it is the perfect implement to commit this type of an offense. And unfortunately, a lot of people, even well-meaning, unknowing, obviously, people sort of feed into this because of biases that they don't really realize that they have in many cases. So yeah, so that's sort of, it definitely was having the toxicology background really led to me viewing those cases with a far different lens than I think most of my colleagues who were excellent in their own right and, did lots of things really great. I just viewed the alcohol facilitated cases much differently because I came with that background of understanding toxicology.
And I do want to underscore that because you're right. It's so great that you were able to talk about two different kinds of offices. And again, you walk into one office in this country, most of these cases, sexual violence, domestic violence, child abuse, with some exception, but most are going to be tried by your local prosecutor. And those offices are very different. In my office, when we came in, you're started at the lower level misdemeanor crimes. A lot of the crimes didn't have witnesses to start, maybe drug crimes or DUIs. But at the time, and not to minimize DUIs, because at the time, though, a different time, also in the 90s, some of those trials, the straightforward ones where there was an injury, they would be given to a new prosecutor. And I bring that up because I always felt lucky for that part. It's like you're being introduced to the system, you're learning the system, you're learning the law, you've got Fourth Amendment issues, sometimes Fifth Amendment issues. They're sort of testing you and you get to put experts on. Because of the BAC. And I always felt really lucky that I had that experience working with toxicologists because it helped me understand a little bit more, although I'm not sure that I planned it. And I don't think the office planned it, helped kind of ground me for the cases when I came into the sexual violence unit to understand. Now, here you are, and we always think, well, a lot of prosecutors, given how they're trained or how they come into units, will never get that opportunity before they're dealing with a sexual violence case and alcohol facilitated. And as you and I both know, the toxicologists aren't, always on the stand, but at least you have the base knowledge. And here you are with this incredible expertise and knowledge. And now you're bringing that to bear. And I know you talked about it a little bit, but I feel like it's such a gift to have that and to mix it in with some of the greatest misconceptions really about, oh, we can't really disentangle these facts. Oh, wasn't everybody drinking? Isn't this just, is this really a rape? And I feel like all of that information that you have, even when you're not putting on or presenting toxicology or that kind of evidence, you're able to explain it. Can you talk a little bit about how you did that in your cases and how you do it now?
Sure. So when it comes to the knowledge of toxicology, I've always, whenever I train it on this, it's most useful because it's sort of learning things that you already knew just from your own experiences. Most, but not all, but most of the people who are prosecuting these cases have the experience of consuming alcohol. Many have the experience of getting drunk. Many have the experience of passing out. And I think a lot of sort of what these cases really need is to be viewed from a lens where you're reminding people of things that they already know. They already know because they've experienced a lot of these things themselves. So I think, having knowledge of how alcohol affects the human body in more than just abstract ways that I think people like to kind of talk about, but knowing how alcohol does affect people, as well as knowing that there are sex differences. And I will qualify, I'm talking about sex assigned at birth. I am the first one to always say there needs to be research on the differences with trans men and women, but we don't have that body of research yet. So I'm going to talk about sex assigned at birth here. There are big differences. And I think that that also affected my willingness to take these cases on, because what I saw over and over and over again, despite the fact that alcohol disproportionately affects women because of the way our bodies, just process that alcohol differently. And I won't get too involved here, but I saw very often prosecutors use alcohol as a sword against victims and a shield in favor of defendants. And what I mean by that is kind of the most common fact pattern that I saw when I would get one of these cases is a victim who drank a lot and then passed out and woke up to a sexual assault, which waking up to a sexual assault is illegal. That is a crime, right? So,
right. Yeah.
There, right?
Yeah, for people who are, we know we have some law students, other people might be listening to this, and most laws are very explicit, and the case law is pretty consistent. And a sleeping victim is an unconscious victim, and penetrating that person, that is not okay. That is not voluntary. It's not consensual.
Right.
But in some places, it meets the definition of an F1 rape because it subsumes a force. Exactly.
And so, but what I used to hear, even though like that part, victims would explain that part. Like I went into the room, I passed out. So, and the next thing I know, I could sort of feel, and I remember becoming aware of, and then I realized, so very clearly coming out of a sleep or coming out of, a passed out circumstance to find often cases, I didn't know who it was at first, right? Like, which is further evidence that this was not consensual. But what I would very often hear is, and I think this is the way a lot of people feel, and this is what I think is valuable to sometimes point out to them, is you'd often hear people say, well, what did she think was going to happen when she got drunk and passed out?
Won't you love that? And it's like, okay, what did I think I would happen if I drank too much?
Right.
Maybe I would get sick. Maybe I'd have a headache. Maybe I would fall down. But rape is not on that list of things I think would happen.
Right. So that was usually part of, I think that's part of a very effective closing, or at least something that should be pointed out. Like there are organic things that happen when people consume alcohol. And the person that consumes the alcohol is 100% and fully responsible for those, right? So having a hangover, that's my fault if I decide to drink too much, right? Making, singing karaoke and doing it poorly, right, is my fault because I made those decisions. Throwing up, becoming sloppy, falling down, all those things are organic, but being raped, while passed out is not organic. That is something that somebody does to you. That is a crime perpetrated on a person. So I do think that's often a very effective thing to point out. But kind of getting back to that original point is, I used to always hear, like, what did you think would happen when she got that drunk? But on the flip side, if a perpetrator was drinking, and usually these involve some amount of alcohol on both sides, not usually, but often, actually, usually, how about if I say that? If a perpetrator is drinking, but obviously not passed out and conscious enough to engage in a sex act of some sort, I would hear people use the alcohol as a shield, right? Yep. You can't blame him. He's just some poor, dumb, drunk guy. So we have, a woman disproportionately affected by alcohol, and we're using it to kind of cast even more blame while using the alcohol to mitigate blame or shield perpetrators. That right there, just that disconnect, that same way of looking at alcohol consumption unequally, using it to help exonerate a perpetrator while helping to blame a victim is a really good example of
Yeah.
the way the system works.
And how you've been able to overcome it. And I think about, I mean, so much history between us. I was so lucky to, be, I think it was a training that I was helping like facilitate, but you were one of the trainers for us when I first started back in 2004. And I think one of the things helping to distinguish blackout and pass out. And again, for people listening, I think colloquially or when we think of, jury instructions, common sense, we sometimes forget that people in their everyday language interchange or use terms that actually don't mean what they think they mean.
Mhm.
And there's a huge, if you don't have a toxicology background or you're not doing these cases, sometimes people were using this as synonymous. And there's a difference between those two things and it legally matters. And I feel like you were one of the first experts to incorporate in a training the importance of making that distinction because when a defense attorney, for example, is able to use them both, it calls into question credibility that is very unfairly. That's not really based in reality and may allow them to introduce experts or other pieces that are not appropriately admissible. So
Mhm.
could you talk a little bit about that? I know it's a little technical,
Sure.
but I feel like, again, it's this piece of where the science and the law and really giving,
Mhm.
helping hold sexual violence perpetrators accountable really come together with you.
Sure. So, look, there are aspects of alcohol that are always going to be problematic and are going to be difficult to deal with as a prosecutor. That's why these cases are so difficult. But I think everyone should be clear about what the differences. So passing out is alcohol is a depressant. It's the natural conclusion of drinking a lot of it is depressed, right? Like you're gonna go to sleep. And again, everybody knows this. You know the feeling of drinking and then just quote unquote passing out in your bed, right? It's certainly a deeper sleep, generally speaking, than what you would normally do, but you're tired. The body wants to lay down and go to sleep because that's how depressants at a very high level, that's how depressants affect the human body. Uh, Blacking out, it refers to periods of time, and this is a fact of some, but not all drinking episodes, is particularly if blood alcohol levels rise high quickly. Um, there may be periods of time for which no memory was encoded, like no long term memory was encoded. And so the next day, you're not going to be able to remember things. This doesn't happen every time a person drinks. It doesn't happen every time a person drinks too much and passes out. It does happen, and most people know that.
Mhm.
A couple of important things to remember. So, first of all, for as much as alcohol is the perfect implement to commit a sexual assault, it is not a hallucinogen. It doesn't cause people to
Exactly.
hallucinate. So, and most people on juries know this, right? Like they know that they don't get drunk and then see ghosts, or like there are drugs that is a concern, but not alcohol. It doesn't cause people to hallucinate. So if you have a victim that says to you, I remember saying no, then the choice is either she said no or she's lying, right? And if there's no reason, my kind of way of processing any sex assault when I was prosecuting these, it wasn't just simply I'm going to believe everything. I've not really ever subscribed to that. What I very much subscribe to is I am going to treat this case the way I would treat any other case, which is I'm going to believe it and I'm going to work forward until I'm given a reason not to. Like I would never say to somebody, who comes in and says my purse was stolen. Now let me see how I can trip this person up. I don't believe it. Like that's the way that as people involved in the justice system, that's just not the way that we handle cases. And it's kind of incredible that we would treat an entire subset of cases that way. But anyway, getting back to the blackout versus pass out, I also think very often Occam's razor kind of applies here. It's sometimes I will become enraged because I'll hear people say, well, women make this stuff up. And it's just like, okay, take a college, for instance. It's not like reporting one of these ends well for the person who reports it. They usually are the ones, in my experience, they lose friends. People make, comments about them. It takes so much bravery in that kind of an environment to want to hold anybody accountable for anything. The fact that somebody is willing to go to the police, make a complaint, follow through with criminal charges, right? Like with memories of saying no, but then to think that during this really brief period of time where you're blacked out, you were actually saying, no, I really want to do that. That is, it's inconceivable. I'm not suggesting, and of course the media amplify, unfortunate incidents of false reports, right? Like we all know about the Duke case. So I'm not suggesting that this doesn't ever and couldn't ever happen, but I do wish that more people would be realistic about, what as I know you heard, I've heard, oh, he rejected her, so she accused him of this. And it's like, can we please just for one moment put our common sense hat on? Like,
right. No, and I think you're right. I think, right. Because if we think about just in the last less than 10 years, that discovery of, what's estimated of, it's estimated that there are 400,000, there were at some point 400,000 untested rape kits, but the different discoveries, again, by prosecutors going into their jurisdictions, finding untested rape kits and trying to remedy injustices, trying to follow the evidence of that failure of evidence wherever it led them.
Yeah.
That is the larger issue. And I think as prosecutors too, you've said it in so many ways so far. We have this obligation. We have an obligation to due process, and we do. The last thing you want to do as a prosecutor is convict an innocent person, but you work hard because the other thing you don't want to do is allow impunity and allow individuals to have their reports dismissed, denied, not followed up on because of these huge rape myths that have built up over the years and have allowed, multiple serial rapists to go on to rape victims across the United States, internationally, to commit homicides and to cause great harm because of these pieces. So you make a lot of great points there. And again, your ability to mix the science and the law on these very complex cases, and not only have outcomes where you explain this to juries in ways they can understand, but you've also helped the field do that as well through your trainings. It's funny, I'm listening to you said so many things. Even I was trying to take notes because every time you say something, I have another question. But even going back to something early you said when you're talking about the beginning of your career back in the 1996, where DNA was being questioned. And I remember, bringing in physical evidence where it was found. It was still, the times where you would be qualifying experts because it was new science. And of course, that science has changed so much. It's just interesting. Recent research, and I'm going to grasp for the date, on the CSI effect, right? And how it impacts sexual violence cases greater than any other case, right? And it's like, but really, I think the little lie there is for some people, there's never enough evidence, even when the
Exactly.
evidence is staring them in the face. And that's why, as prosecutors, it's felt like such a gift to be able to just put forth a mountain of this evidence so that it cannot be denied. It cannot be denied.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think that prosecutors have an obligation to build these cases, as high as they can. Of course, everything can be, I think the frustrating part and what makes these crimes so especially cruel, is that look, I wasn't a prosecutor before DNA. As I mentioned, I started kind of at the inception of the DNAs, but I think anecdotally that the defense used to be more before DNA. I didn't do it. Like, we
Right.
didn't have, are you kidding me? She's whatever. I wouldn't have said, right. Then there's DNA and everything shifts to she wanted me, right? Like the consent defense obviates the need to, so comes to the emergency room. She, she was, very, victim blaming, what's a kid like you doing on a pub crawl, all of that typical stuff. But she actually goes and finds the guy, and her police report said things like, I asked him if he had engaged in intercourse without the victim's consent, and he said no, she wanted me.
Yep.
In fact, I wasn't that interested in her. And then, she talked about, like, she looked around his apartment with his permission and didn't see any evidence of date rape drugs, which, as we say, like, were you expecting to
Right.
a great big vat,
Oh,
really
right.
labeled my stash of date rape drugs? But so anyway, she said that she found the victim to be not credible and didn't expect anything to come of this. Well, the rape kit results in the toxicology came back like 6 weeks later, and it was positive for GHB. It was the first confirmed case in Monroe County.
Unbelievable.
And that's when the case made its way to my desk. And when I talked to now here are all the things that weren't done that could have been done, right? If that officer had cared at all, or taken this seriously, you know, while it's fresh, going to talk to the bartender, no. Checking to see if there's any video, no. Talking to the defendant or the victim's friends, no. Checking to see if there's video outside the house, no. Checking, seeing if you could build up probable cause to do a search warrant. You could actually look places that might actually reveal something more than just looking for the great big cookie jar of date rape drugs,
Right.
which is, no, none of that. And when I called her, she didn't know that it was assigned to an investigator after it came back positive. And I said, like, I don't know if you're aware of this, but it was positive for GHB. She posited that the victim gave the drug to herself because the defendant was a college student and was way better looking than she was.
Oh, Jen.
This is where I just this is where I say, like, there's a lot to be learned from that, from an
Yes.
investigative standpoint, right? Like, and again, I think part of it is just I dug my heels in at the beginning and was convinced this didn't happen, and I'm not going to back off of that. But she also just was emblematic of the mind frame of a lot of officers and investigators. Hopefully that's shifting a bit, but that's the way it was.
No, and now you've taken, and again in your training, so you talked so many in so many different ways about those different, even those individual investigative steps to take in a case of a drug facilitated sexual assault. And of course, we could talk all day. That's another level of complexity. But all of those pieces Are those things that you had done in your, put out in your trainings too? Did that influence your trainings that I know are multidisciplinary and have sometimes prosecutors and law enforcement?
So I would say the biggest yes. Though those should be done in any cases, whether or
Right,
not this
right,
victim, whether again, regardless, just take that fact pattern as an example, and it did turn out to be a drug facilitated. But any case where a victim says, I was passed out and I woke up and this was happening, the first thing that any investigator should be doing is going back and seeing if you can find corroborative evidence, right? Like looking at clothing, I mean, there's just so many things these days, as in addition to like, what was this person like when people last laid eyes on the person? Were they slurring their words? All the things that DWI, checkpoint officers are really good at, right?
right.
Their coordination was terrible. They were mush mouthed, or were slurring their words. They were inappropriate, like loud or whatever. They were stumbling. These are all pretty good indications that somebody's pretty drunk, and it's probably only going to get worse over the next hour or so in terms of absorption and everything else. But you have to at least take those steps. You can't
Right,
be dismissing it because it sounds incredible to you.
right.
It's, I think people undersell how much I more than anything, I just so loathe this notion that there's this whole group of people that are out there just salivating to falsely accuse people of crimes. Like it is, again, I come back to Occam's razor. You can believe that if you want. It is so counter to everything that you know about people, which is, not wanting to turn the spotlight on something that is mortifying even when consensual, right? Like this is just not an area of one's life that people are anxious to invite people into in general. But like all of the negative things, like I just it's I think that shift needs to take place at a societal level. I think that will help things immensely.
And I think doing that in the courtroom as you do, I mean, I feel like as you've illustrated so well during our conversation, yes, there's the highly technical scientific piece and understanding it and explaining it maybe through expert testimony and bringing in understanding the other ways to talk about it. But then there's also the basic relevance or irrelevance of certain information and communicating to the jury of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense and really breaking it down. I say the simple things, the motive of the victim, what they have to gain from this, what all the independent pieces. I think demonstrating that as the prosecutor, you were able to on two different levels, you were able to really improve that victim's experience of being able to amplify their voice because I mean, I think about that case that talks about prosecution ethics, and the prosecutor represents the sovereign, not the party, and you have to use every legitimate means to bring about justice. And I feel like that's right. You've like shown us it's all the understanding the legal research, the social science, the science,
Mhm.
medical, bring it all together. But you also have to use your argument and your strategy and your advocacy
Mhm.
to cut through all of the flares and all of the smoke that the defense puts up to distract the fact finder from the very real and clear cut facts of a victim.
Right.
And even in the most complex cases of what has happened. So
Yeah.
I thank you so much for that. You've done it so well and you explain it so well in the trainings. And I guess I would ask you, would you encourage law students today to consider prosecution and specifically to consider careers focusing on sexual violence, child abuse, domestic violence, stalking, trafficking, any of these special crimes?
So unequivocally, yes. And one thing, just taking a step back from that, I always tell like young people that are even in college or high school, they think they want to be a lawyer. And I always encourage them to major in something in college that is not like the typical pre-law or whatever, right? Like make yourself a little different. Maybe like for me, having a science background was incredibly valuable because it was a good thing at the time. But I can't articulate enough like the impact that you can have on people's lives in terms of being a prosecutor and prosecuting these kinds of cases. Domestic violence and child abuse and sex assault. Sex assault being in my experience the most difficult ones to get convictions on, especially when they're alcohol facilitated. Look, I only ever had 2 stranger rapes, to be frank, that fit into the category of being attacked by a stranger. One was somebody crawling in the window, and another was someone being attacked on a porch. But that is what the community expects. That's not what they get. But I'm sure that this is your experience as well, having done these. Some of the most endearing letters that you will ever get, win or lose, are from victims saying that the fact that you took their case seriously enough to take it to trial, and you're talking to your victim very candidly and honestly about some the obstacles to justice, but some of those are really things that you'll never get over if you end up in this arena. And being a prosecutor in this space, it's life altering, really. It really is. It's transformational, and you don't forget it.
Well, Jen, I think that describes really what you've done for the field around, especially around alcohol facilitated sexual assault. You probably don't even know how far your impact has reached. So thank you for that. And thank you for spending time with us today to talk about your career and your journey and the ways that prosecution has helped you make an impact on these cases. Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure. It's great to talk to you, Jen. Thank you for everything you've done. I truly, the field is so lucky to have you. So thank you.
Oh, thanks, Jen.
You're
Okay.
welcome. All
Bye-bye.
right. Take care.